Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Barcomb. I'm the writer and the creator of the all ages comic, The Amazing Adventure of Superior Sam. Um, tell you a little bit about myself. Um, I'm a medically retired police officer. I have a progressive nerve disease, and I'm a below the knee amputee. Superior Sam actually came as an idea to teach kids about people with disabilities, particularly limb loss. So I actually was teaching in an after school program, and I taught a kid who was on the spectrum. He was autistic, and he didn't understand why I wasn't going to be his teacher. So I tried to find him a book, couldn't find him a book, and I ended up writing a story for him, and that's how Superior Sam came to be. But along with being a retired police officer, I also played competitive paintball for over a decade. I've coached, traveled, won, been everywhere. I helped run my local comic shop, and I am a massive comic book reader. Um, Big Captain America guy. So comics for me is a lot of fun, and making comics is a lot of fun. I enjoy it. I find it to be very therapeutic. But with anything, I like to know the history of something. I'm a big history fan. I live down in Central Virginia, and all throughout me are Civil War battlefields and Revolutionary War battlefields and historical places you can go and visit. And there's so much you can learn. And comics history is something that I always found very fascinating. So if you're not familiar with comic book history at all, there's a lot of great books by it. One of my favorite books, if you really want to get into it, is it's called Comic Books Incorporated, and then there's also another one that is called Marvel Comics: The Secret History by Sean Howe. And these really give you ideas as to the comic books industries, its origins, and how this processes work. So those are two things. But the first comic book was created in 1934. And when I say the first comic book, I'm not talking the first comic. I'm talking the first, what we would consider traditional floppy comic book. We call these floppies occasionally. And that's a single issue comic. And that was in 1934, and it was Famous Funnies #1. And what this house did is they took all of the Sunday comic strips from this one particular comic. I actually think it was 4 or 5 different comics. And they just assembled all of those strips. So, and then they bound them and they print them and they sold them as a bundled story. And it took off. It was extremely popular because you have to think about what's going on in the 1930s. You have the Depression, you have World War One that's about to come. Entertainment is not what we have today. You don't have cell phones, you don't have movie theaters, you don't have car. Well, you have cars, but not like well, I can get in my car and drive to a bookstore, drive to a mall, drive to a library. They don't exist in that capacity. Most people don't have a TV. When you're going to the movies, because there are movies, you're going to a theater and you're paying a dime and you're spending all day there. You know, it's a much different time. And comic books were this kind of need that filled an entertainment void. Most of your entertainment back then came from the radio. So when comics came out, it was a big deal. And in 1938, Action Comics #1 came out. And that's the first appearance of Superman. And Superman is credited as being the first comic book superhero. Now, prior to this, and a lot of people like to argue, the Phantom, who was a newspaper strip comic character, was the first superhero. And there's another one that's a magician that I always forget his name, but those two get thrown around. But really, the first comic book character is Superman. He's your first superhero. And then you get characters like Batman, Captain America, and Wonder Woman. A lot of people never realize just how old a character Wonder Woman really is. And she is one of these golden age characters because in comics, comics is defined in eras. You have the golden age, which is the very beginning. You have the silver age, which is where a lot of what you know today in the lore of comic book characters and superheroes comes from, is their silver age mythology. Then you have the bronze age, which is like the late 70s, 80s. Then you get what we call as the current era, which is 90s, 2000s, things like that. And depending who you talk to, some of these eras, they overlap, they stretch. It's funny. I was talking to somebody who's like, oh, there's a pewter age. So it's a very weird way of like But really your traditional is you have golden age, silver age, and current. That's the easiest way. And bronze is the most common of it. But comic book history is a fascinating thing because a lot of people don't realize this, but it was immigrants that created comic books. It was actually Jewish immigrants. Um, a lot of your favorite comic book creators were created by Jewish people. And a lot of people don't know that. And they're like, why is that important? Well, here was a group of people that had just come to the United States, was looking for work, looking for things like that. And they got into this industry and they literally created it from the ground up in a lot of cases. When you're thinking about Captain America, when you're thinking about Spider-Man, the Hulk, almost any Marvel character, Stan Lee was the writer, Jack Kirby was the artist, both Jewish heritage. It's this very important thing because someone always asks me, because they know I'm a big Captain America guy. They're like, why is Cap your favorite character? And I'm like, because of what he stands for. When you read those early Cap comics, they're the corniest things you'll ever read. Golden Age comics, if you can't pick out the bad guy or the villain in like the first 3 pages, I don't know how you, like, I don't know. It's so easy. The stories were so simple. But when you saw this larger than life character just come right out in that first issue and he's punching Adolf Hitler in the face, it was like, bam, comic books. Like you couldn't make it any clearer. And that's what you remember. But one of the things that I always like to talk about too is the embarrassment. If I looked at you right now and I said the name Stanley Lieber, I'll bet you 90% of the people watching this video or listening have no idea who I'm talking about. Well, Stanley Lieber is actually Stan Lee. And he didn't want to use his real name because comic books were also thought of as a cheap second-rate entertainment business. So he was saving his real name for when he actually wrote a real book or a TV show or a movie. He was saving it for that. But then you have somebody like Jack Kirby, whose real name is Jack Crescent. I can't say it, pronounce it correctly, but he changed it. And people are like, why? And he's like, because I want everybody to know who did this. So it was a very important time when you looked at it and what came out of this and what these people and they were doing. And then it expanded. If I could tell you anything about comics that you might not think of, it's how widespread in comic books are. This is one of the most progressive mediums in entertainment you will find. Before you had black superheroes on the TV screen, you had them in comic books. Same with Asian superheroes. When you start looking at all of these things, the comic book industry is really on the ground level of expanding and bringing all of this together. When you're thinking Wonder Woman, she's one of your original, like, first 5 superheroes. And it was a woman in an era that is dominated by men. But somebody had the idea to bring a female superhero into it. So it's a very progressive medium, and it's a very open medium. When they see something wrong, a lot of comic creators call this out too. You know, whether it's what you're seeing going on right now or what you would see going on in the past. These were people that were very outspoken and very proud people, not only what they did and what they created, but they weren't going to be bullied by anybody about it. So comics history is very important because one of the things you see is people struggling. Comic books are a struggle. It is not something, you know, some people create a comic in 5 minutes. They'll have the idea, they'll have it done, wham, bam, whole package, probably 10 days. There are other people that will spend decades working on one single idea. So some goes real fast, some doesn't. But that's the grind and that's the struggle that comes with creating something, with creating anything. You're not going to always get it the first try. And when you look at comics, you will see ideas that started one time. The Flash is a great example. You have a Golden Age Flash, which is Jay Garrick. You have a Silver Age Flash that becomes Barry Allen. Most people know Barry Allen better than they know Jay Garrick, even though one existed before the other. It's the same with the Green Lantern. You know, it's not the same people, you know. But then you also see the progression of the characters. where somebody might retire or somebody's killed and somebody else steps up and takes their place. And this progressive kind of movement is very important in comics. And knowing that history is something that's very important, because whether you're a comics fan or not, one thing a lot of people don't realize is most of your modern entertainment comes from the comic book industry. When you look at Marvel movies, they're almost always inspired or based off a comic. When you look at The Flash or the CW TV shows, comics, even Riverdale. If you're a Riverdale fan or a Sabrina the Teenage Witch fan, comic books, these were Archie comics before that. When you're looking at things like DC's YA and kids original graphic novel lines, all inspired off comic book ideas. Batman Hush is an animated movie. You know, so many ideas come from these. We know Captain America is a movie. He's one of your oldest superheroes. You might have saw the Runaways TV show, that is on, I think it's on Hulu now. If you have Netflix, Lock and Key, Umbrella Academy, all of these things started as comic books. There's a show that's getting ready to drop on Netflix called The Old Guard. It was a comic first. One of the reasons comic books get picked up and adapted is because of how how similar they are to the movie industry. If you've never looked at a movie script, it's very similar to a comic book script. They have a lot of things in common. I'll show you my comic that I did, but this is the script for it. So you'll see we have the title. We have the title of the actual story, characters, settings. You might see dress codes. But then we're breaking it down. So imagine instead of panel 1, it's scene 1, all the dialogue and what's being said. But then when you look at a comic, when you look at a movie, you'll see sometimes they have these background boards, these scene boards, they call them. They're literally comic books. So what's better than trying to make something when you can actually already see it, just like you're seeing here, because somebody's already drawn it. They've already done the storyboard for it. So you see a lot of this. And, one of the things that, one of the biggest complaints I see right now, especially from people in my age group, and to give you an idea, I'm 35 years old. I'm tired of the reboots and the repeats and the sequels and the prequels.
Yeah.
Well, when you look at your original source material for some of the most popular things on TV and in the movies right now, guess where it's coming from? It's comic books. And yes, there's a lot of repetitions and they do a lot of the same things over and over again. But so much of that new material comes from this. Just to give you an idea, Netflix has adapted The October Faction was a TV show. The new Liam Hemsworth movie, I cannot think of the name of it. That was a comic book first that debuted on Netflix. Umbrella Academy is a comic book. Lock and Key is a comic book. All of the Marvel stuff, the Punisher, the Daredevil, the Iron Fist, all comic books. When you look at DC, how many Superman movies have we had? How many Batman movies have we had? If I have to hear about release the Snyder Cut one more time, like that trends because they know this material is out there. These were all comic books. And one of the reasons for the success is because of the passion that the actors' portrayal of these characters, but also because they can read, they can learn the history of these characters because there's that information and you can see it. My favorite thing is when someone goes and sees a TV show or a Netflix series or a movie, and then they go to their local comic shop or their local library or their local bookstore and they go, hey, I want to learn more about this. I understand he started here. And it's a chance to grow and to educate, and to expand the medium, because anything doesn't survive without fans. So it's very important. So let's shift, kind of the history and where we're going into making comics. Like I said, I do my own all ages comic book called The Amazing Adventure of Superior Sam. I'm the writer and the creator. But let's talk about a comic book. Like I said, you might call it a floppy or a single issue, but a single issue comic, varies on what it is. There's digital comics. You have original graphic novels, trade paperbacks, hardcovers, you name it. There's lots of different ways you can see this kind of stuff. But let's talk about comic books, what you see. Normally, you're going to see the title right across the top. You're going to see the title. You're going to see the issue number. You might see something like the price tag, usually across the top. You're going to see a byline, who's creating it. Usually the byline are the two biggest people on it because name recognition sells things. But then you're going to see the cover. When you're creating something, when I published my first children's picture book, my editor at that publisher, and since then I've had many editors that I've talked with and spoken to, the most important things to selling are the cover, the back page, and this. Because you're going to sell a book or something you created in 5 seconds. It's going to be off what they see. And when I wasn't joking, when I say it's the flip, because nobody's reading it right away, they're flipping through it to see if it entertains them, if it appeals to them. So, and not everybody's sense of style is the same. That's another thing that's so cool with comics. There are comics with stick figures, and then there are comics with full-blown, hand-drawn, digitally drawn art, or even in some cases, painted art. One of my favorite artists is Dustin McGinn, and he does everything in watercolors. Alex Ross is probably one of the most famous artists. You can see a poster behind me in the back that's, I can't get my hand straight, but yeah, it's this one of Captain America. He draws it in pencil, and then he paints these on canvas in Giselle. I think I'm saying that right.
Wow.
But his artwork, just like an image like that, is tens of thousands of dollars. So, I mean, if you can't write, there's plenty of jobs for you. And that's another important thing in comics. Yes, you have comics that are made by one person, but usually it's a team. When you're thinking of comics, you're thinking of the writer. You're thinking of the penciler or the artist. You're thinking of the inker. That's the person that literally draws these black lines around everything or does the shadowing. Like that's one whole job, is just inking it. You have the colorist, and that's literally the person that applies all of the colors. You have the letterer. That's the sole job, is just to draw the letters in the panels. How many people do you know actually know all of these positions? If you're a diehard comic book fan, it might be a lot. But if you're just a fan who only thinks, well, I can never do that because I can't write and I can't draw. Well, can you trace? Can you color? Do you have really nice handwriting or very unique handwriting? Then there's a job for you in comics. Or you get the people that you don't see behind the scenes. There are people whose sole job is just to do the layouts, to figure out how to fit all of this into a traditional size comic. You know, there's that person that does the layouts. There's the editor, which, as I told the kids in the teen class, is basically the teacher. That's the person that's going through and looking for mistakes, keeping track, making sure you're on time, critiquing it, giving you advice or feedback. Then you have the publisher. That's the company that puts it out, that's setting the release schedule for when it comes out. Or in some cases, if you're doing what we call as a big two book. A big two is Marvel and DC because they're the biggest two comic book companies. They own all of the rights to these characters. So they're the ones giving you permission to do that. And then you get things like attorneys. Yes, comic books have attorneys because you have things like legal pages where you're putting a disclaimer in there that says you own the copyright. You know, these are your creation, so nobody else steals your idea. So there's lots of jobs in the comic book industry. And then one of the things too is, I would say, you know, I'm kind of an outgoing person. If you meet me initially in person, I might be a little quiet, but when we start talking comics, I get very excited. It's something I can easily talk to you about for hours. Ask my girlfriend, it bores the bejesus out of her. But it's something I'm passionate about, and it shows. But I don't know how to use social media that well. I don't know how to make my own website. So there are jobs for people that are just doing the online side of it, the marketing side of it. So there's lots of jobs in comic books. You know, there's not just what you think is a writer and an artist. There's way more jobs to it. We even joke sometimes that some creators have street teams and their whole job is just to go to places and sell the book. You know, if you're a new publisher, you've got a comic, one of the hardest things to do is to get word of mouth. Social media is great for that. You have Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. If you're on Reddit, there's Discord, there's TikTok. There's all these places where you can go out that don't cost any money and you can promote your comic. You can put your comic online. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got came 2 years after I published my first comic. And it was from a pretty big creator who said, if I can give you any advice, save yourself some money and don't print your comic right away. Put it on places like Webtoon, Tapas, Comic Central that don't cost you any money to put your comic on there, but can actually generate you a little revenue. But it allows you an opportunity to expand your audience and to save money for when you can do things like shows and things like that. You have no idea how many Comic Cons that I go to where I'll literally walk up to a table with an artist who will have a photocopy of a comic he does and then a card that's above it, his business cards that say, read me on Webtoon, read me on Tapas, catch me on Comic Central, you know, catch me on Comixology. And then he's just doing sketches at the show because he's just doing whatever he can to pump in to get his name out there. So there's all kinds of jobs in the comic book industry. But let's talk about creating a comic. A comic's idea can be found anywhere. If I tell you I've told you the origin of Superior Sam. It was me losing my leg and trying to teach a kid about people that are missing a limb. Now, there's two commonly found ways with limb loss. There's being born without a limb, and then you have what is called a trauma, which is a car accident, an IED, that's an explosive, or just some way, shape, or form you lose the limb unnaturally. So there's two different ways, but I wanted to write a story to address a trauma because that's what happened to me. I had a training accident when I was a police officer and I developed a nerve disease that destroyed my leg. But try explaining that all to a 7-year-old. I know adults that I couldn't explain this to, but I was able to write a story, to have somebody draw pictures, and it all made sense to him. And it all starts with just an idea. And so let's talk about an idea. Let's look at my comic now. So we'll take a look. This is the comic that I did for this project. And it's called Left, Right, Left, Look. And it's by Chris Barcomb, that's me. And then you've got panel 1, panel 2, panel 3, and panel 4. Now let's talk about this. What do you think this is about? Well, this comic is about crossing the street safely. The idea was to teach kids how to cross the street. And it came off of an idea from a company called Tiny Superheroes that I was working with. And they wanted to create a series of comics using some of the Tiny Superhero kits. And they wanted it to be educational and to have some kind of lesson to be learned. But they wanted them to be short and they wanted them to be free. So I thought up a bunch of different ideas. I came up with all of these. I wrote these out. I scripted them like you saw. And then I tried to find artists. And the project ultimately fell apart because we couldn't find an artist that could do this project for free. Now, it's a good project. It's a great project because Tiny Superheroes is actually a nonprofit organization that makes capes for kids that are in and out of the hospital all the time. So they can feel special, so they can feel like they belong. And the reason I show you this book is because Super Silas right here, he's a tiny superhero. He's a real life kid. He's a real life fan of the series. And I met him at a show. And meeting him inspired me so much that I made him a character in my comic with his parents' permission. But it inspired Silas because he got to be a superhero in a comic book. And then what happened? tiny superhero heard what I had done for Silas and came to me with a chance to do something for them. And even though we couldn't do it, I was honored by the opportunity, because with anything, it was practice. And that is an important thing in comic books and in anything. Practice makes perfect. If you've never heard this saying, it says it takes 10,000 hours to be a master of something. Well, 10,000 hours is practice. It's repetition. It's doing it over and over to the point where you can do it without thinking. Well, that's what writing is, and that's what's being an artist is. It's practice. It's doing these things over and over, and it's learning from others and getting advice. You know, when I do Comic Cons, I do normally, now this is pre-COVID. Last year I made 53 appearances. That's school appearances, but I did a Comic Con at least once a month, and most of the time twice a month. So you figure I did almost 20 different Comic Cons. And what did I do? I did like most other people at Comic Con. I walked around with my comic book and my business cards to every comic creator that I could find, even if I didn't know them, and I gave them to them, and I asked them for advice. And I said, what can I do to make my comic book better? And accepting criticism is an important thing, because it's not meant to hurt you sometimes. Yes, some people are genuinely mean people, and I apologize for that. But sometimes people have the best intention. If they tell you, hey, this lettering here that you got using Microsoft Word, it works, but it doesn't look very good. I tell this to people all the time. That's one of my pet peeves is I don't like standardized lettering. I like when you do it yourself, because I visually don't think it looks very good. Or when you use oversized word bubbles, because they take up so much of the panel. If you use some of these like standard word bubbles, you'll see they're massive, and you lose all this extra art because of a word bubble. So it's, you know, it's important to be able to go out there, and let's talk about just coming up with a comic. The first thing you need is an idea. Once you have your idea, hopefully you have a character. Then you need to come up with how you're going to tell your story. What's the beginning? What's the middle or the climax? How are you going to end it? You know, comics are notorious for using cliffhangers, and they do it for two reasons. One, because most comic books, single issue floppies, aren't long enough to tell a whole story. But two, they need the money. They want you to come buy the next book next month. So what's a better way to do that than dun, 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 it's another part of the story you didn't know, but you got to check it out next month to get the rest of it. So comic book creators, they do these things, and there's reasons for it. But when you're looking at it, you know, you have to be thinking like that. And then you might be thinking, well, I'm not an artist. I can just write. Or I can draw, but I can't write. How do I find somebody to work with? Well, think about it. Do you go to school? Any of your classmates draw? Go to the local art teacher. Go to your English teacher and say, hey, who's a really good writer? They'll tell you. Believe me, your teachers know. Who's a really good artist? You'd be shocked what you can get by just going to a comic book store or a library and going, hey, do you know any comic book artists or creators? Because these people that work here usually will. They'll know what their clients get. I'm not trying to sound scary when I tell you this, but I literally know the make model of most of my customers at my comic book store's vehicle. So when they pull in, I know their name and I know what books to pull out before I even see them get out of their car. But not only that, I know what they like. So when I'm trying to sell a book, maybe there's a new book that's coming out, I could be like, hey, I know my buddy Donnie won't care, but Donnie is a huge Green Lantern guy. I'll go, hey, Donnie, there's a new Green Lantern book coming out. Do you want me to get you a copy? And Donnie's going to be like, yeah, because I ask, I learn these things. But, you know, if you don't have the social contacts like schools, libraries, colleges are great too. Go put a want added up in a coffee shop. You'll be amazed how many people will answer you. When you look at like my comic, I don't draw my comic. I work with two different artists. I work with a gentleman named Josh Nickerson, who lives in Atlanta, Georgia. And I work with another artist named Yarfe Azami who lives in Indonesia. I've met Josh in person once, but we do all of our communication online. But how did I meet Azami? I met Azami because I put up a post saying I was looking for an artist, and I went on Reddit and I said, "Hey, I'm looking for an artist," and people answered. Now I have Twitter. Oh man, Twitter makes it so much easier. But not only is Twitter great for trying to meet people, it's great if you have a question because you can throw it out there and you'll usually get your answer. But you don't get that by not following other people or talking to other people. Another thing, you want to get better at doing all this, you want to master and do your own comic, read comics, read books, go to places, have experiences, live your life. Your life experience can become a comic. A very famous comic is called Mouse, and it's all about the Holocaust, and it's told by Art Spiegelman's father. There's a comic called Persepolis, or I'm not sure I'm saying it right, but it's all about one woman growing up in Iran in the late 80s, 90s. There's so many comics that are actually not just about superheroes. They're based off so many different things, and you can use this medium to expand that. But all it takes is an idea, and once you have that idea, just forming it and growing it. When I did Superior Sam, I had an idea because I knew what I wanted to do and how I wanted to teach that kid. But I actually made a chart. I made a little pinwheel chart. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, it was just something that looks like this. And then, the ideas expanded out. It looks just like this. So Sam was my idea, an amputee superhero. And then it was like, oh, it would be cool to do one with a shoplifter. It'd be cool to do one about a girl superhero. It'd be cool to do one about this. But then it was like, oh, girl superhero. Her name's going to be Olivia or Viva Fox. Like, I just kept adding to these long things. And I have a whole notebook that is just full of these ideas. And then what did I do? I started writing them down, because what happens, the more you write out your ideas, and we call this flushing it out, but the more you're spending the time, you're literally forming the story. When I write a comic, my comic books actually start off as short stories. I actually write the art into it and everything. And then what I do is I go back through the original story, and it might be 8, 9, 10 pages, paragraphs, whatever. But then I break it down, paragraph or section at a time, into each individual page. It's something that I do that really works for me. I'm going to get something and I'm going to show you. You have to forgive me. Like I said, I'm missing a leg. I don't have it on, so I have to crawl everywhere right now. But I buy deluxe editions of comic books. These are, this is a deluxe hardcover, and it collects the Black Mirror. Now, one, I'm a huge Batman fan, and I love Scott Snyder's early writing, and I love Jock. I love this art. But one of the reasons that I bought this book, it's actually at the very back of the book. Because I'm not an artist, but look, I have preliminary art from Jock in here. So if I'm an artist, I can see his foundation, where he started with. But I'm a writer, and guess what? It's got a script that was done by Scott Snyder. And Scott Snyder's way better than I am, and I'm not trying to sell myself short or anything. But you have to learn somewhere. They make books about writing comics and all that kind of stuff, but sometimes asking a question or reading it and seeing it, you can emulate it and duplicate it. I'm not talking about copying somebody's idea. I'm talking about growing. If you looked at my script for the first Superior Sam comic, and you look at my script for issue 9, which we're working on right now, they are night and day different, because I learned along the way. I would go to shows with just scripts, and I would say, hey, can you help me with this? And I was lucky enough that there were creators that would help me, and they would teach me, and they would show me. But I got that by asking questions. And if you're somebody who's shy, And you can't do that. Like, my girlfriend is terrified of speaking to celebrities, I guess would be the easiest way to say it, or famous people. But me, I'm a little more outgoing. Like I said, I used to be a police officer. So talking to anybody doesn't really faze me that much. But go with somebody who might be more outgoing. And even if you don't say a word, tell them what you want them to ask that person. And think about what's an important question. Because if I can emphasize something too, there's usually more people trying to meet somebody. So you can't be there all day. One of my favorite writers is Tom King. I met Tom King, and I don't mean this to sound rude, when he was a nobody. He had just gotten a big 2 book for the first time. Most people in the comics book industry didn't know who he was. He was doing a signing at a store, and 4 people showed up. And because Tom King used to be in the CIA and I used to be a police officer, we had this common ground. But then Tom King blew up. He does Batman, Mr. Miracle. He's huge. And I saw him at a show, and it was a half an hour just to see him again. Like, I had to wait in line for a half hour. And this is not a joke. I've waited in line hours to meet certain creators. But I got up there, and he wanted nothing to do with me. Like, I was trying to ask questions, and he didn't want to talk about it. He just signed my comics and actually threw one on the ground. It wasn't intentional. It was an accident. He just slid it, and it slid off the table. But I called him an idiot. And he looked up at me, and he goes, "Oh, I know you." And I was like, yeah. And this is where I'm going with this. I work in a comic book store. Do you know how many copies of his comics that I've sold or gotten people on because I was a fan? And this was my interaction. And he apologized, and I've never held it against him. Sometimes you get busy. You don't have time to answer questions. But at the same time, sometimes you'll be on Twitter. I've learned Twitter is great for this. Shoot a creator a message, or just just tag them in a post and say, "Hey, at whoever, can you give me some advice?" And ask your question. And you'd be amazed. They usually will answer it. And if they don't get upset by it. I tell people all the time, writing something even for panels like this and drawing it, this little mini comic took me 45 minutes. Now imagine I'm doing 8 to 10 page floppy comics. That's usually how many mine are. But imagine doing a 24 page comic, but doing 4 or 5 of them a month. It takes time. So you might not get that answer you want. But if you don't have that opportunity and you don't try, you don't learn. When I was first getting into the scene, I met Neil Adams. He's a very famous creator. He's well known for his DC work, particularly Batman in the Green Era. If you ever wonder why Ollie has the mustache, that was Neil Adams. But I was talking to Neil Adams, and he never stopped drawing. And I was more fascinated by watching him draw Batman because he is this well-known creator. But he said, "Hey, kid, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'll answer them while I draw." And then when somebody else came up, he said, "Hey, I'm sorry, I can't answer any more questions." He was very polite about it. But he said, "If you ever have any, just shoot me a message. I'm glad to answer you." So it was this big deal. He didn't have to talk to me, but he took the time to. So if somebody doesn't, don't get upset about it. But also, too, talk to everybody. You don't have to go to just the biggest name on the advertisement. You can go to the little guy, because I don't know how many people I talk to that, if I could describe being a comic creator like being a celebrity, if it's like A-list, B-list, C-list, D-list, E-list, F-list, I'm like a D level and maybe a C on a good day. But I know A-level creators. You might walk up to me and be like, "Hey, I'm working on this book." And, I do a lot of people, when I talk to them, it's about children's comics because that's what I do. But they might come up and they go, "Hey, I know you're a big comic book fan. What are your thoughts on this?" And I'll read it and I'll tell them, because I read tons of comics. I read over 100 different comic books a month.
Wow.
Like, I read a lot of comics, and I know what I like, and I give you feedback. I'm one of these people that will answer your questions if you ask me. But if I don't know the answer, I'm not afraid to go to some of my friends who might better know the answer and ask for you, and then come back to you and say, "Hey, I asked my buddy, he told me to tell you this. But you don't get that if you don't talk to people. But with that too comes practicing. Like I said, I used to play competitive paintball. I used to go out in my backyard in my apartment complex where I grew up when we moved to Virginia, and I would just sit there and practice. And if I couldn't afford paint or I couldn't afford air or I didn't have, it was raining, I would just practice in the mirror, and people would be like, how did you get so good? And they're like, you only come to the field on weekends. And I'm like, but I practice all the time. I learn ways to do it. Somebody, I told this earlier, I see a lot of creators that are like, oh, you have to have a laptop and you have to have, Procreate if you're an artist because we all do it digitally now. You don't. All you need is a pen and a piece of paper. A pencil, piece of paper. That's it. You can create a comic. Think about this. They created these in the 1930s. Was a computer around back then? No. And there's something to be said by looking at that old art too, and those old scripts and those old stories, and you can see the evolution. You can see the growth. When you're trying to create, one thing you're going to notice is you're going to constantly learn to critique yourself. And you need to develop kind of a tough skin because people aren't going to tell you things to be hurtful. Like I said, some people are, but most people aren't. They're trying to make you better or they're trying to give you advice. And I tell people, I take advice like this. I try to think about how the person came to that advice they're giving to me. Do they have more experience than me? Do they have a reason that gave them that thought and why are they telling me this? Or what drew it? But where I'm going with it is as you start to go, if you read issue 1 of Superior Sam, you read issue 1 and you read issue 8. For me as the creator and the writer, I feel like my writing is night and day different. My tone is the same. I know my audience, but I've learned so much from this issue to this issue. And this is 3.5 years. When I started doing this, I was writing children's picture books. It's a different medium. I had to learn how to write a comic, and luckily I read comics. And I had friends in the industry that I could go to and I could ask. But, at the same time, I'm still learning things. I just saw something 3 months ago when I joined Twitter. It was the first day I joined Twitter and it blew my mind. And one of my favorite creators was like, yeah, I try to not write any dialogue longer than 1 line. And I was like, what? And then I went back and I looked at all his comics from over the years that I have. And sure enough, he only writes 1 line of dialogue. I had somebody who came up to me and they said, we love your comics. We think they're great. They're a little wordy. I do a kid's comic and I try not to do more than 35 words per bubble. And I was like, and that strived to me because I took that as a challenge to make myself better. Because what did I do? I would go to some of the kids at the schools where I speak and I'd say, hey, how many of these words do you read? And they'd say, like half of them. Or they'd be like, I don't know most of them. Kids are great. I will tell you this right now. Kids are extremely honest. Lying is not something they're very good at. So if you want really good critique, do a kids comic and then go talk to kids. They're going to tell you what they think and they're going to be very honest about it. And it's not being done in honesty, like I said, in a way to be mean. It's just they don't know any better. But, I wasn't afraid to ask for advice. I wasn't afraid to ask for help. It's the same thing with my scripting. Azami came to me after issue 1 and he's like, dude, your scripts are horrible. Here's some of the other scripts that I get from some of these other artists that I work with. Can you do it more like this? And then I started tracking down these, anything that had extra art in it or extra scripts. And it sounds really nerdy to be like, hey, I'm buying a book literally because I get to see the script. Well, I'll tell you how big a nerd I am. I go to shows where writers sell just their scripts. And why do they sell it? Because people like me want to buy them to read them to learn how they did what they did so we can better ourselves. That's why places like your library are very important because you can go and get materials, books. You have access to things and it doesn't cost you but a card and maybe some time. And if you can't get it from your library, there are resources within the libraries that they can go to and ask if another library has this, and they can get it. So don't be afraid to ask at your library or ask at your local comic shop. You have no idea. We have in our comic book store, my owners are teachers. So my best friend that runs my comic book store, he's a teacher, both he and his wife. And when we have kids in the store, if they can't afford a comic, we usually will give them one comic. We keep boxes full of comics just to give away. We keep promotional posters to do this. We keep all this stuff. And people are like, why do you keep that? Because some people can't afford these things. We keep supplies, pens, papers, pencils, markers, Sharpies. We keep this stuff. I don't know how many times I'll go to a friend or a creator and I'll be like, hey man, that book was really cool. And they're like, oh, do you want a couple copies for the shop? And I'm like, well, I don't know if we'll sell it at the shop, but would you mind giving me a couple so if somebody comes in, I can give them to them? And they're like, yeah, sure, no problem. But then there's places like Webtoon, Tapas, Comic Central, Comixology, where you can go online and read comics for free and you can learn. You don't always have to be reading the big two or the next great indie hit. You can read just Superior Sam. Right now, because of the pandemic, I know a lot of creators that are putting free digital codes up on their Twitters and their Instagrams and their Facebooks. They're putting free content on places. Like I said, you can actually read all 8 issues of my comic for free right now on Webtoon and Tapas. Or you can go and buy them. And if you buy them, that's money for me to put towards issue number 9. But I felt there was a need for entertainment, so I put my stuff out there for free. But one of the things that I found is even though I haven't sold a lot of comics during the pandemic, I'm getting a lot of views and I'm getting a lot of feedback. And to give you an idea why that's important, go on some place like Amazon and try to sell your product. Amazon works on algorithms on feedback. You need 25 feedback just to show up on some of the main Amazon search pages. So unless somebody's specifically searching The Amazing Adventure of Superior Sam, it's probably not showing up on the general because it might not have 25 feedback. So think about that. You need these things. So even if you're reading it for free, you can help a creator by just leaving them feedback or a review. When you go on Webtoon, you click that little star thing. If you think I deserve a 1 or a 5, it doesn't matter. It's feedback. And then somebody else might look at that and go, hey, that comic's got a 5-star review. It was recommended because I liked this. Well, that grows. You've just found something new. So you can do a lot. But when it comes to creating comics, the best advice I can give you is to practice and to do it and to not be embarrassed. I'll tell you a story. It's a very funny story. One of the biggest comic book franchises ever is the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It started off as a black and white flip comic book that was extremely violent about 4 genetically modified turtles. They all had the same color mask. They all had everything. But when you think of the Turtles now, that started as a comic book that was printed at a Kinko's. These were guys in a house that word of mouth got it out, and now they have one of the biggest licensed properties ever. But here's the thing. One half of the original creators sold their rights to it, to the other guy. So one gets really rich and the other gets kind of rich. But you never know what's going to be an idea. So if you do have an idea, save it. Don't throw any of this stuff away. I'll end it with one of my favorite comic book stories, and it's about Batman. There's a great documentary on Hulu. It is called Batman and Bill. Now, Batman is credited for most of the better part of his creation. He was created in the 30s. Yeah, I think he was 1939. But when Batman was created, it was because Bob Kane saw how much money the guys that created Superman were making and said, I can do that. So Bob Kane says that he went to his house and he found an old sketch from when he was a kid. And he took it to a guy named Bill Finger, and Bill came up with the idea for the story. But then Bob went back to Bill and said, hey, the contract's only for me, so I'll pay you on the side. Bob Kane was rich when he passed away. Bill Finger died alone and in a small little apartment in New York, nobody knowing what he did. So it's kind of interesting when you think about it, because Batman, you learn so much. It's that Bob Kane had, whether you believe he saved this image or not from his childhood, it doesn't matter. But he had the foresight to save this. And he had the foresight to go to somebody else and to ask them for help. But it also teaches you the lessons about getting your credit and when your credit is due. Because here's the thing, even though the average fan didn't know who Bill Finger was, all of these creators all over the years all know Bill Finger. When you look at the creators from that time, they all knew who he was, and they all said what happened to him was wrong. So it's Batman is one of the most popular comic book characters alive, and it's a fun story and it's a sad story depending on how you can go. But that's what makes it a great story. And that's what you want to do with a comic book. You want to tell a story. So don't be afraid to tell your story no matter what it is. And don't be afraid of what people tell you about your story. Believe in yourself. Trust me. You ever want a fan, go talk to your family, your friends, your girlfriends, or in my case, my first editor was my cat. I used to read my stories to my cat. And if she put her paw over her head, I knew it was bad. And if she stayed paying attention to me, I knew I was doing all right. I also learned that if I dingled my fingers, went like this with my fingers, she paid attention more. But I tried to find anyone I could to listen to and tell my stories. And being a good storyteller is very important. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to contact Gina or Afton over at the library. They know how to reach me. I'm on Twitter. Just look up Chris Barcomb. I'm on Instagram. You can look up Chris Barcomb or CB Author. My email is theamazingsuperior.sam@gmail.com. You can find my comics on Webtoon, Tapas, Comic Central, Comixology, Etsy. If you want to buy them, they're on Etsy. If you want to check out my comics, you can go to my website, chrisbarcombauthor.com. One of the cool things with my website is actually I'm posting original Superior Sam stories right now that I've never made into a comic. I'm just posting them. If you go on my Patreon, I have Patreon. You don't need to pay me any money. I'm not asking for your money. But you can go on there, and I've started to post fan fiction about what I think certain superhero stories should be. One of the reasons I tell people I'm posting all this stuff is because I'm trying to get feedback and critiques and opinions from my peers so I can learn and make my stories better. And have a goal. My goal is to have my name on a Captain America comic one day. That's my goal. But my real goal was just to help people. And I've done that. You'd be amazed what you can do with a comic book. I go to schools and I talk to kids, and I'll tell you this last story. And I talk about not being a bully. I talk about being nice to people. I talk about making comics. I talk about comics history. And one of the very first schools I ever went to, I was talking about being disabled. And I was showing somebody my leg. And because I was able to stand out in front of a group of people and show off my disability, somebody was able to talk about theirs who had never talked about it before. And I saw that person a few years later. And they told me that it changed their lives. That interaction and what I had done had motivated them to talk about themselves, and it made them more, people understood them better. It made them more friends. They didn't imagine what their life was like. And this is a child. We're talking a 9-year-old kid who turned 12 and was like, I got a girlfriend. And it was a big deal for him because I don't think this was ever something he planned on, but he had just talked to somebody. So no matter what you're writing, it can make the night and day difference for people. When I lost my leg, Somebody gave me a copy of Captain America: The Winter Soldier by Ed Brubaker and Steve Epting, and it changed my life. Not in the way because I became a comic book writer because of it, but because I went out and I found the other comics in the story. And because I was going out, I wasn't sitting at home and I wasn't depressed. I was making new friends. And eventually I learned how to tell these awesome stories from it. So you'd be amazed at what you can do with just a comic, and even if it's just one you make on your own. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Have a great day, make a comic, and at the minimum, read a comic.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, no problem.
I had a couple of questions.
Sure.
I was wondering what you were saying about like stuff coming out in comics more longer ago than you would think. I remember reading somewhere how long ago the Black Panther was invented, and it was longer ago than I expected, but I don't remember when that was exactly.
He's a 1970s comic book character.
Okay.
So when Marvel and DC were the big two, and they still are, DC was always kind of known as the more like wholesome comic company, even though their characters nowadays are a little more violent than what they were. DC was always the like Superman was, make sure you sweep the porch off if you track the mud on it. But Marvel was the comic that was listening to the people. And they're like, hey, the civil rights movement's going on. We've got, this large majority of people that's being ignored in popular culture. Let's bring that in. Let's get these people in here and give them people to look up to. And you had characters. It was Luke Cage, Sam Wilson the Falcon, and Black Panther were the first 3 black superheroes in Marvel Comics. And then they were like, hey, there's all these people, overseas in Asia and in China and that are here in the US. And, what about them? They need a hero. And at the time, you had all these martial arts movies. Bruce Lee was huge. So you had the Master of Kung Fu. And then you had Iron Fist. And comic books, they're this, when they started, it's really funny because comic books, when they first began, women were treated, kind of like second class. Women's rights weren't as important. And when you read like early Fantastic Four, Sue Storm is not as important. But then as you keep reading them, you start to see this shift. And Sue starts to become a little more important. Then she's really the big standout character. And that's because comics followed what people were saying and doing. Whereas other mediums weren't doing this. Comics were kind of there the entire time. So.
And you mentioned also a lot of the early creators were Jewish immigrants. Was there any kind of even older tradition of comics in Europe before that? And like, is that where that came from?
Well, I don't know if it's where it came from, but you can go back and you can find early picture stories. I mean, dating all the way back, if you think about it, hieroglyphics can technically be a comic book. You can look at what's on there because it's a story told in a picture format. That is what is a comic book, essentially. So you can go back in time. But what was funny about it was when comic book creators started coming up, they were Americans because comic books are an American platform. This is something we created. It's like jazz music. This is a predominantly an American creation that then expanded out. But it was these people that, and I don't mean these people like in a bad way, but it was these Jewish people that were trying to do whatever they could to get a job and earn money and do whatever. And they were taking their talents, and they were doing the art for the pulp books of the times, and they were writing all of these stories. It was whatever they could do, and then it slowly started to morph. But what was happening is they were going and they were like, hey, I need a writer. Hey, brother, you want to be a writer? Or hey, sister, you want to come write this? And they were going to their families and they were recruiting within, or they were going to other people they grew up with. but it was this Jewish culture that really birthed comic books. So it was really, it's an impressive thing to watch, and I'm not saying like other religions and other races and things like that, but when you think about it and you read some of the comic book history, it's very, heavy in Jewish culture. These creators are, and it's something there's a great story about Jack Kirby. And they said, when the comics came out, when they were coming out in the golden age, before you had the Comics Code, which was the censory group, the kind of great, controlled comics, they said comics were getting into World War II because they knew there was something wrong with what the Nazis were doing. And comic creators like Jack Kirby and Stan Lee and Joe Simon, and they were like, this is wrong. We're not going to tolerate this. And they actually took their characters to war before we ever went to war. But there's a story about Jack Kirby getting a call in the Marvel Comics or the Timely Comics office back when he was doing Cap. And it was some guys that claimed to be Nazis that wanted to beat him up because he had drawn a comic showing Adolf Hitler getting punched in the face. And Jack Kirby is just like, is like, you're down in the lobby right now? Cool, I'll be there in a minute. And he hangs up the phone and he's go down because he's going to defend himself. He's going to defend what he does because he believes in it. And he gets down to the lobby and nobody's there. And, they're on the phone with the police, calling the police. And he's like, I don't have to settle for anything. But it was something too that these creators were doing that was expanding and growing. When you looked at immigrants that were coming into America, they were poor. And these creators, these Jewish and Irish immigrants that were working in the comics industry, really created, a place for themselves, in entertainment. And it really birthed an industry when you think about it, because they were willing to do a job that other people didn't felt was below them or belittled. Remember, I talked about Stan Lee and not wanting to use his real name. Well, that's because people were embarrassed to make comics back then. But there were other people that were very proud of what they did. And when you think about it in terms of modern entertainment, it's a very, think about all of the top selling movies of the last 5 years. Most of them have been comic books. And if they hadn't been brave enough to do this, you wouldn't have these things.
Yeah. And my last question is, you mentioned you're writing your first non-comic book. Can you say what it's about?
So I am writing a young adult fiction story about a pair of witches. It's kind of like Onward meets Harry Potter meets Modern Warfare, the video game. I just finished my first draft of the actual, like the whole story. It's just under 40,000 words. It was probably one of the most nerve-wracking things I've ever written.
Wow.
I do a lot of comic book scripts and fan fiction, but this was something that stemmed out of a dream that I had, and I told my girlfriend about it, and she said, you should write that down. And then bit by bit, it just grew and it grew to where I at least have a working draft. And even if I don't ever publish it, it'll probably be one of the proudest things that I've done, because writing a book, writing a novel is extremely difficult. And I am extremely humbled by just having tried to do it and experienced it. So.
Okay, that's cool. I'll have to keep an eye out for that if you get it published.
That's my goal. I even joke that I may just self-publish it, because if you really want to have a conversation, the comic book industry and like getting a comic book job with like the big two and stuff, it's pretty difficult. You pretty much need an agent and things like that. But I still swear, hands down, publishing a book was the most difficult thing I've ever done in my life. Like, it requires you to be able to follow instructions, be able to take criticism and rejection. And I'm talking like cold rejection, like they're not even going to reply to the email you sent them with all of your info, like your story on. Like, they just blow you off cold turkey. Like if you don't hear from us in 6 to 8 weeks, we didn't care. And it's like, damn, really? But, you know, it was hard, but it kind of toughened me up and it made me a better person because I was willing to take that criticism. And now I can take that critique and I've learned to follow directions. Because if a publisher of a book tells you, hey, I want it, you know, I want 10,000 words and not 10,001, 9,099. I want 10,000 words. I want the first 10,000 words. You give them literally the first 10,000 words and nothing else. Because what happens if you give them 10,001, they don't read it because they already know you can't follow instructions. And how are you ever going to be able to listen to an editor or listen to a creative content person? You know, you get some leeway here and there, but it's not the easiest things in the world sometimes.
Wow. Well, cool. That was all so interesting. Thanks, Chris, for
No
doing.
problem. Thank you for having me. I hope everybody has a great day.
Yep, we will. All right.
Bye.
Good rest of your weekend.
You too. Thank you.